Hey everyone, it's Ed Gutowski, and what I wanted to do was to talk about the next step in understanding how rhetoric and argument works. So we've done a great job. We've done a great job of defining rhetoric. Most class still likes to use the term persuade as part of their definition. I'm still going to maintain that rhetoric is words used to mislead, deceive, and con people. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to explain how rhetoric separates itself from an argument, because there's something that rhetoric always uses that a strong argument would avoid, and that is something called fallacies. So I think it's important that we kind of discuss what are fallacies, how do they work, and how to identify them. Now we know that rhetoric and argument use three things: logos, pathos, ethos. Logos is logic, pathos is emotion, ethos is character and authority. So how does rhetoric separate itself from argument? Well, it uses something called fallacies. If I was in a ground class, what I would tell students is to take out a piece of paper, and I would have the term fallacy written on the board, and then I'd ask students to define what they think that term means. Some students are familiar with the term, some students aren't, but just by looking at the term, what do students think the term fallacy means? And if you kind of hear the word fallacy, notice it kind of sounds like something fake, something that is phony, something that is false. And all of these are great definitions of fallacies. I merely define a fallacy as false logic. And I think there's a merit in understanding how fallacies work, because once you understand how they work, right, they start to make sense. There are some fallacies that are really easy to identify. Some are silly, and some are just plain up stupid. But if you go out in the real world and you accept my definition of rhetoric for a second, just accept that, okay, rhetoric is words that are used to mislead, deceive, and con someone. And then you come across someone out there in the real world who's using rhetoric, and you catch them using a fallacy. You catch them saying something false, something that is phony, something that is fake. What happens is your brain starts to critically think, and rhetoric is less likely going to have an impact on you. And if you look in our textbook, I really like Everything's an Argument. There are a couple of fallacies that I really, really like, right? One of the fallacies that I really like is the ad hominem. And an ad hominem is when you attack a person's character rather than addressing the issue. So imagine that you have a student who's taking our online class and he says, hey, don't take Professor Gutowski, he's just like Hitler. Don't take Professor Gutowski, he's just like Saddam Hussein. Don't take Professor Gutowski, he's a son of a bitch. Well, notice what that student did was he used an ad hominem. He attacked my character. He didn't address an issue. He said, hey, don't take Professor Gutowski's class. His online class is confusing. Don't take Professor Gutowski's online class. It's a lot of work. Don't take Professor Gutowski's English class. He doesn't get assignments back on time, right? Rather than addressing an issue, that student attacked my character. And then another, I was going to see if I could find an example in here, but I don't have one. But another fallacy that I like is the non sequitur. And the non sequitur is when you would tell two totally things that have nothing in common and you try to relate them together. So the non sequitur, you try two things that have nothing in common, you try to relate them together. So that same student might say, hey, don't take Professor Gutowski's class, it's just like being at Auschwitz. Don't take Professor Gutowski's class, it's just like being at Dachau. Don't take Professor Gutowski's class, it's like being at a concentration camp. And notice what that student did would have used a non sequitur. They would have associated two things that have nothing in common: our class and a concentration camp. And the reason that these two fallacies I like is, notice we see them all the time. And we see them very much in the political world that we live today, right? We have a presidential candidate who's very good at using the ad hominem. We often see a lot of times non sequiturs of politicians to getting us to vote. So I think these two fallacies I see all the time, so I like them very much. The other fallacy I like is the bandwagon, and the bandwagon is pretty straightforward. Everyone else is doing it, why aren't you? Everyone else is taking Professor Gutowski's class, why aren't you? Everyone else is smoking pot, why aren't you? Right, but these are just three of the fallacies that I like. I think there are something like 17 fallacies in our textbooks. The two that sort of really interest me are equivocation and paralipsis. I really like these fallacies a little bit more. They sort of force you to critically think in a little more detail. So I just want to give you kind of a brief lecture on fallacies. kind of have a basic understanding. And now you kind of have a discussion board question, which you're going to look over. I think there are 17 fallacies in our textbook. Which fallacy do you like the best? Which fallacy do you like the least? And then kind of why do you think I picked paralipsis and equivocation as two of the fallacies that interest me? I'll look forward to seeing what you have to say.